Penned in 1864 by the renowned Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky, Notes from Underground stands as a pioneering work of existentialist philosophy, powerfully championing the concepts of personal liberty, accountability, and unique selfhood. This remarkable text serves simultaneously as profound social commentary, a biting mockery of Russian nihilism, and an exploration of human psychology so penetrating that Friedrich Nietzsche later remarked, "Dostoevsky, the only psychologist from whom I've anything to learn." He ranks amongst the most beautiful strokes of fortune in my life. To deliver his most relentless and passionate critique of the nihilist trend, Dostoevsky utilizes an exceptionally bleak and unlikable figure, the anonymous anti-hero identified simply as the underground man, whose narrative exposes the inescapable, despairing predicaments born from such ideologies.
Through this novella, the author issues a stark caution against a multitude of dangerous philosophies rapidly gaining traction during the 1860s, such as political and moral nihilism, utilitarianism, rational egoism, atheism, determinism, utopian visions, and the early seeds of communism. You'll notice that the narrative subtly weaves all these ideological threads into its fabric. However, to truly grasp the gravity of Dostoevsky's alarming message, you must first examine the specific historical climate that birthed this masterpiece.
2 years prior, in 1862, Ivan Turgenev released Fathers and Sons, a highly celebrated Russian literary work that introduced the public to an unusual ideological trend embraced by the younger generation, termed nihilism. Originally a mere synonym for general skepticism, this concept had mutated into a potent force of political and moral rejection, characterized by the belief that a true nihilist refuses to submit to any authority or accept any unproven principle, regardless of how sacred society might consider it. Consequently, the individuals subscribing to this movement proudly identified as ultimate deniers, aiming to completely dismantle every established cultural and societal ideal. Within this radical Russian framework, rational egoism surfaced as the prevailing social doctrine, asserting that true logic dictates the absolute maximization of personal advantage, a concept closely mirroring the utilitarian goal of optimizing collective happiness and well-being. The architect of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, even devised a quantifiable method known as the hedonic calculus, attempting to mathematically gauge the exact balance of suffering and joy produced by any action, thereby reducing the prediction of human conduct to a purely logical equation. Viewing the ascent of rational egoism as an urgent threat, Dostoevsky feared that its glorification of selfishness would corrupt vulnerable youth, stripping them of fundamental morality and steering them toward a ruinous, unethical narcissism. This toxic perspective is flawlessly encapsulated by the protagonist's famous declaration, "I say let the world go to hell, but I should always have my tea." Reflecting on his European travels, the author observed that Western society was dominated by a stark principle of isolation and intense self-preservation, where the individual ego defines itself in direct opposition to nature and humanity, elevating the autonomous I to a status equal to the entire external universe. Pushing back against this alienation, Dostoevsky advocated for a return to the soil, highlighting the paramount importance of spiritual faith, familial bonds, individual duty, and compassionate kinship, fostering a community where people willingly surrender their own needs for the sake of others. He fiercely defended this type of deliberate self-sacrifice, arguing that it could never originate from cold, self-serving logic. Conversely, the underground man is deeply infected by this egoistic individualism, viewing himself as a sophisticated, modern thinker completely devoid of any altruistic instincts. The author explicitly underscores this reality in his introductory footnote, clarifying that while the diarist is fictional, such a character is an inevitable byproduct of the contemporary social environment, and absolutely must exist within their modern culture. Notes from Underground was ultimately crafted as a direct rebuttal to Nikolai Chernyshevsky, a leading voice among Russian radicals, who had published the influential novel What Is to Be Done in 1863. Chernyshevsky echoed Rousseau's philosophy, suggesting that humans are fundamentally decent and rational creatures who only become tainted by their external environment. According to this theory, once science and logic illuminate our authentic self-interests, humanity will seamlessly engineer a flawless civilization. In this theoretical world, governed entirely by the rational pursuit of personal gain, the very capacity to commit malicious acts would vanish, making rational egoism the foundational pillar of a flawless utopian future. The ultimate ambition of these radicals was to engineer a highly regulated world, populated by individuals functioning with mathematical predictability. They envisioned this paradise as the Crystal Palace, an emblem of supreme human triumph, where every conceivable societal issue would find a resolution. Chernyshevsky argued that universally adopting a radical socialist approach would successfully transform human civilization into this magnificent Crystal Palace. Furthermore, he heavily promoted absolute determinism, entirely dismissing the concept of free will, a rigid stance that Dostoevsky subsequently dismantles with devastating brilliance through the erratic behavior of his underground anti-hero. Within the pages of Chernyshevsky's utopian text, a character expansively praising rational egoism poses the mocking rhetorical question. Do you hear that in your underground hole? Exactly 1 year following that provocation, Dostoevsky delivered his literary counterstrike by publishing Notes from Underground. He maintained a starkly contrasting view of human nature, convinced that people are inherently chaotic, unpredictable, and prone to ruin. Therefore, pure intellect could never tame our volatile urges. As secularism rapidly expanded, Dostoevsky perceived this atheistic shift as a catastrophic trajectory for civilization, firmly insisting that only a profound faith in Christ could guide humanity through its intrinsic darkness. Following the author's passing, his dire warnings materialized into tangible reality, notably his foresight regarding the ascent of totalitarian regimes. He thoroughly examines this peril in his novel Demons, serving as a powerful allegory for the disastrous fallout of the political and moral nihilism gaining traction during his era. Marxist ideology eventually morphed into the communist systems enacted by Lenin and Stalin, convincing the masses that a flawless, godless society was attainable. They promised a utopian golden age where limitless abundance would be distributed equally, supposedly eradicating human misery forever. Ultimately, these absolute regimes rationalized mass murder to serve their ideological goals, culminating in the horrific slaughter of the 20th century. And sadly, we continue to ignore these historical lessons, perfectly illustrating Hegel's observation that history only teaches us our failure to learn from it. In our current era, a collective delusion afflicts Western civilization, wherein horrific atrocities are frequently concealed beneath the appealing guise of progress in yet another misguided pursuit of a perfect society. Within this context, we encounter the quintessential anti-hero, the underground man, a resentful, isolated, and self-loathing 40-year-old former government worker who resides entirely out of sight. The original Russian manuscript describes his dwelling as a cramped crawl space overrun with vermin, completely unsuitable for human habitation, which perfectly elucidates his self-identification as a mere mouse. He has lingered in this subterranean confinement for years, eavesdropping on humanity through a crevice in the floorboards, while composing these very dispatches from the depths. Ultimately, this subterranean existence functions primarily as a potent symbol of his deep-seated estrangement from the rest of humanity. From within this self-imposed physical and mental isolation, he delivers his searing confessions to you, the audience. He immediately declares his physical illness,
his vindictive nature, and his utter lack of physical appeal, noting a suspected liver ailment, while stubbornly refusing medical treatment out of sheer malice. A self-destructive defiance he explicitly states you will fail to comprehend. This opening sequence instantly immerses us in his bizarre conduct and profound psychological anguish, as he rapidly oscillates between declaring his sickness, his bitterness, his ugliness, and finally, his failing internal organs. He endlessly modifies his self-description to manipulate the perceptions of an invisible audience. Yet he consistently fails to articulate his true nature. It becomes glaringly obvious that his actions completely defy the principles of rational egoism, as he actively works against his own well-being. He admits in his writings that he could never truly embody pure malice, constantly recognizing numerous contradictory impulses warring within his own psyche. These suppressed emotions swarmed inside him, desperately seeking release, yet he deliberately forced them down until the internal pressure triggered intense shame, physical convulsions, and a profound, agonizing sickness. Ultimately, this protagonist exists as a turbulent storm of contradictory emotional drives, locked in a desperate struggle to uncover his own identity because he genuinely lacks a coherent sense of self. This existential void torments him relentlessly, even though he accepts it as his permanent, inescapable reality. To cope, he retreats entirely into the realm of literature, severing ties with the tangible world through obsessive reading, which inevitably makes his actual encounters with reality devastatingly hollow, leaving him capable of conversing only in stilted, bookish phrases. Yet, amid this dysfunction, he delivers piercing revelations regarding the human mind, noting that, while some memories are shared only with friends or kept strictly personal, the most terrifying truths are the ones an individual is frightened to admit even in private, with the most honorable individuals harboring the largest collection of these deeply suppressed secrets. Throughout the narrative, Dostoevsky draws a sharp contrast between two distinct human archetypes, the individual driven by action and the one burdened by intense, acute consciousness. Our narrator harbors immense jealousy toward the active man, who navigates existence effortlessly without becoming entangled in endless self-reflection. This active counterpart possesses a simpler intellectual framework, liberating him from the agonizing philosophical inquiries that entirely cripple the hyper-aware underground man. To illustrate this, the author introduces the metaphor of the stone wall, standing as the impenetrable barrier of scientific determinism and undeniable natural laws, such as the mathematical absolute that 2 times 2 equals 4, which one must simply accept as irrefutable truth. This wall serves as the ultimate boundary restricting human free will. Driven by a desire for vengeance and a crude sense of justice, the man of action charges at his target like an enraged bull, only to be completely stunned into silence when he violently collides with this immovable barrier of reality, which abruptly halts his forward momentum. Conversely, the underground man refuses to accept this natural limitation, employing endless psychological gymnastics, and rather than gracefully retreating, he repeatedly fractures his own skull against the masonry, fully aware of his endeavor's pointlessness. He acknowledges his physical inability to demolish the obstacle, yet he refuses to surrender his autonomy to mere physics, violently rejecting the notion that an insurmountable barrier should offer any kind of philosophical comfort. Finding every conceivable path of action completely inadequate, he remains utterly paralyzed, trapped in what Dostoevsky describes as a perpetual state of inertia, where thought flourishes, but physical execution is impossible. He is afflicted by the most debilitating sickness imaginable, extreme consciousness, proving that excessive contemplation is genuinely a terminal disease. This crippling hyper-awareness completely traps him, generating a reservoir of concentrated malice far deeper than anything the active man could ever muster. Consequently,
The paralyzed intellectual fails to forge any solid identity, mourning his inability to become a villain or a saint, a scoundrel or an honorable citizen, lamenting that he could not even manifest as a triumphant hero or a despicable insect.
Presently, I spend my days isolated in my own space, tormenting my mind with the bitter and hollow reassurance that a truly intelligent individual never actually achieves anything of substance, and that success is reserved solely for fools. While he clearly recognizes his own shortcomings, the active person remains blissfully ignorant and utterly convinced of their own greatness. Because he possesses a sharper intellect than anyone he encounters, the underground man seeks comfort in his mind, yet he remains painfully aware that these same people outrank him entirely in social standing. His profound arrogance fuels a deep belief in his unmatched intellect, leading him to look down on everyone else. However, the moment he realizes he desperately craves their validation, his frustration with their apathy transforms into a deep hatred, plunging him into intense self-disgust over this shameful reliance. He views the practical, active individual as the true standard of humanity, while perceiving himself as an artificial creation, something bred in a test tube rather than born naturally. Even though no one actively labels him this way, he dubs himself a mouse, effectively building a psychological hell entirely from his own obsessive internal ruminations. In his own words, this unfortunate creature surrounds itself with a multitude of miseries born from uncertainty, turbulent emotions, and the scorn heaped upon it by straightforward, active individuals. Ultimately, this creature has no choice but to wave away the abuse and retreat into its mousehole in absolute disgrace, wearing a fake smirk of disdain that it cannot even convince itself is real. Down in that foul, subterranean refuge, the beaten and mocked creature gives itself over completely to a freezing, vindictive, and perpetual bitterness. It will spend 40 years obsessing over its perceived wrongs down to the finest, most embarrassing specifics, constantly inventing new layers of humiliation to cruelly tease and torture its own psyche. Essentially, the underground man buries himself alive beneath a mountain of malice. Yet, an unexpected twist emerges within his narrative. He subsequently reveals that this exact condition of absolute misery, dissatisfaction, and hopelessness serves as the very source of his profound enjoyment. He acknowledges that you and the average person will likely fail to comprehend any of this bizarre phenomenon. From his perspective, human awareness is a terrible curse, yet it serves as the fundamental catalyst for free will and individuality. A sentient being is doomed to suffer, but stripping away that consciousness would obliterate freedom entirely, serving as a sharp critique of determinism. As he notes, every event unfolds strictly according to the fundamental laws of intensified consciousness and the inevitable inertia generated by those laws. Consequently, you find yourself utterly incapable of altering your nature, lacking even the basic attempt to try. He derives an irrational pleasure from his own suffering, discovering delight even in the throbbing agony of a toothache, which causes him to moan maliciously, simply to inflict distress on those nearby. His sadistic tendencies are matched only by his own masochism, which he openly confesses without hesitation. He describes experiencing a bizarre, contemptible thrill when returning to his dwelling in Petersburg on the foulest nights, suddenly struck by the intense realization that he had committed yet another dastardly action that day. In the shadows of his mind, he would ruthlessly nag and accuse himself until that bitter guilt morphed into a shameful, intoxicating sweetness, eventually culminating in real, positive delight. This euphoric sensation was present entirely because he was so intensely aware of his own degradation. Ultimately, the essence of his activity stems directly from being plagued with an overwhelming boredom. Driven by a heightened consciousness, he finds himself entirely incapable of halting his relentless stream of thought. To live, in some way, he invents adventures for himself and constructs a fabricated life. He recounts countless instances where he intentionally took offense over absolutely nothing, fully recognizing the absurdity of his manufactured outrage, yet pushing the charade until he reached the point of being genuinely offended. Although he is committed to the principles of rational egoism, he simultaneously functions as an opponent of it throughout the entire novel. His conflict originates from a profound clash between human nature and the laws of nature. Even as his reason assures him that changing for the better is impossible, he refuses to abdicate his consciousness to determinism, desperately clinging to his individuality while going against the comfortable predictability of life. He questions what is to be done with the millions of facts proving that men, despite fully understanding their real interests, have deliberately left logic in the background to rush headlong toward peril and danger. He challenges you to consider scenarios where a man's advantage might genuinely require desiring something inherently harmful rather than advantageous. The Underground Man writes that humanity is by no means a rational animal, and that he will perpetually rebel against the idea of a utopia, acting against his self-interest, simply to validate his existence and confirm his individuality. He characterizes our species as monstrously ungrateful, suggesting that the best definition of man is the ungrateful biped. Yet this lack of appreciation is not his worst defect. His greatest flaw is a constant deviation from moral order. You need only take a quick glance at the history of mankind to observe this erratic behavior. He notes that while you might say anything about the history of the world that a disordered imagination could invent, the one thing you cannot say is that it is rational. Finally, the Underground Man asserts that a person would eagerly sacrifice all advantages just to be independent and choose for himself, regardless of how devilish those choices might be. Man would actively desire what is injurious and incredibly stupid, solely to exercise the right to desire independently. Ultimately, this caprice of ours may in reality be more advantageous for us than anything else on earth. The author identifies a profound paradox at the core of our existence, describing it as an unparalleled benefit that completely shatters any logical framework. To protect this ultimate prize, which is nothing less than our distinct individuality and unique character, you might find yourself willingly throwing away health, wealth, security, and even basic contentment. He envisions a scenario where, surrounded by perfect societal wealth, a cynical, backwards-looking individual might suddenly step forward, hands on his hips, and suggest tearing down the entire rational system. This provocative figure would urge us to cast all logical calculations aside, demanding that we return to living by our own wonderfully foolish and unpredictable whims. The Underground Man does not completely condemn intellect, but rather targets a rigidly logical interpretation of reality that entirely ignores our primal urges and complex emotions, which run much deeper than pure reason ever could. You inevitably possess a profound drive to behave exactly as you please in any given moment, aggressively rejecting the sterile paths dictated by cold logic and personal advantage. Even if you are completely submerged in a utopian paradise, smothered in endless luxuries, and tasked with nothing more strenuous than eating sweets and multiplying, your inherent spite would eventually surface. Out of sheer ingratitude, you would inevitably sabotage that flawless existence, purely to remind yourself that humans are independent beings, completely distinct from mindless piano keys, waiting to be struck by the predictable laws of nature. Dostoevsky decisively dismantles the illusion that increasing our rationality will automatically result in a more joyful and progressive society. He criticizes the tendency to treat human existence as a solvable mathematical equation, designed merely to force individuals into alignment with collective social interests. Since you are far more complex than a simple instrument, unlocking the universe's mechanical rules will never provide a satisfying resolution to your deepest internal struggles. In a world where every single outcome is perfectly calculated and explained, genuine choice would vanish, leaving behind an unbearable monotony that would force you to actively defy reason, perhaps by insisting that 2 times 2 equals 5, just to violently reclaim your own autonomy. If utopian thinkers counter that even this chaotic rebellion could be anticipated and neutralized by advanced algorithms, returning us to a state of flawless order, the stubborn human spirit would simply choose absolute madness to defeat the system. Dostoevsky witnessed this exact psychological phenomenon during his grueling imprisonment in a Siberian labor camp, observing how the oppressive environment sparked terrifying emotional explosions among his peers. He characterized these sudden, violent hysterias as agonizingly desperate cries for self-expression, where a person's completely shattered identity aggressively clawed its way to the surface through frantic convulsions, intense malice, and temporary insanity. Those who champion logical self-interest must eventually concede that our behavior remains fundamentally erratic, ensuring that any rigid utopian blueprints are destined to collapse. While no one denies your innate passion for building roads and establishing complex civilizations, an undeniable and fiery attraction to absolute ruin permanently haunts the human psyche. We harbor a deeply ingrained terror of actually finishing our grand designs, perhaps preferring the intoxicating process of construction over the stifling reality of inhabiting the finalized structure. It seems we are deeply amusing creatures, bound to a cosmic joke where our relentless ambition is permanently coupled with an irrepressible urge to shatter everything we create. This metaphorical structure represents the Crystal Palace, an idealized endpoint of human evolution, where all internal battles, aspirations, and hardships are permanently extinguished. The underground man explicitly refuses to bow before this flawless architectural marvel, citing the simple fact that such a perfect monument would never tolerate mockery or a defiant gesture. Dostoevsky argues convincingly that you will never truly surrender your right to experience suffering, provoke chaos, or engage in the deeply satisfying act of breaking the world around you. In fact, humanity frequently develops an intense, overwhelming infatuation with its own misery, embracing pain as an absolutely indispensable component of a fully realized life. Despite our constant pursuit of joy, we possess an undeniable genius for engineering our own profound unhappiness, operating much like a dedicated chess player who thrives on the tension of the match rather than the final checkmate. Attempting to eradicate every trace of hardship and replace it with a mandatory endless bliss ultimately drags us further into despair, because authentic human experience requires a careful balance of both agony and elation. You are left to consider a fascinating ultimatum: whether a superficial, easily acquired contentment could ever rival the profound depths of elevated suffering. I will conclude our exploration here by asking you to reflect on these timeless philosophical questions as we wrap up this discussion on the beautifully irrational nature of the human mind.